Kathleen doing all right, is
She's
she?
fine.
We don't see her very often. It's sort of out of our way. We go this way every now and then, but going to Kyoto, we just accept occasions.
Okay, this is March 29th, 1984. This is Joe Todd, an interview with Mr. Ainsworth Moore. Sir, where were you born?
Well, and a lot of people call it Skullyville, but the post office name was Oak Lodge. And its first name was Choctaw Agency. And if you have been around any, it's about a mile and a half east of here. I was born within that range. Cemeteries there. Most of my folks are buried there. So
When's your birthday?
May the 23rd, 1907. So I was about almost 6 months old, I guess, at statehood.
Who is your father?
Edgar A. Moore.
And who is your mother?
Martha Ainsworth.
Were they both from Indian Territory?
Yeah.
Okay.
They were both born there within, I'd say, a half a mile of.
And they're both Choctaw?
Yeah.
Okay. What kind of work did your father do?
That's always a hard question for me to answer. I guess you'd put him down as farmer stockman. Most of the time, the farming end of it was tenants doing it, but he did have a ranch down southeast of town in later years. But and he dabbled in politics. He was a member of the first legislature.
He was.
Just one term. I never did think to ask him whether he had enough of it or whether he ran again. I think one term was just enough. Back in those days, I don't think they paid enough to even pay your expenses up there.
Did he ever talk about that first legislature?
Not too much. Of course, at the time he was there, I didn't know. I was too young to remember any of it, but no, I don't recall him. He wasn't the type to just volunteer. And a lot of times we'd ask him things, and he was either reluctant or he didn't know. But he was fairly active in Indian politics, and he was always active in state politics, that is, just as an outsider, more or less.
Did he ever mention the Sequoia Convention?
I don't know whether he mentioned it or that I have read something about it. I would just maybe have to say no. But there was a lot of activity, and I found out later in reading old letters and things. I had an uncle who was delegate to Washington, and some of the correspondence back and forth of what was going on and all. But I don't remember my father ever saying anything about attending. Of course, time I could remember, why, it was old stuff. And
Did your excuse me? Did your uncle talk about the Sequoia Convention, or just in the correspondence?
No, I don't remember. The only thing I remember them. Now, this uncle was my mother's half brother, D.C. McCurtain, and they'd come back years later and talk about Indian affairs and old times, but I just don't remember as far as Sequoia Convention.
What are some of the old times he talked about?
Well, my mother was more talking than of the childhood of theirs and the early, just local things of people and all. And but my uncle was a lawyer, and he lived around a number of places, Poto, here, McAllister, and he spent the last, I guess 10 or 12 years of his life in Washington. He was on, I think, some commission, Bituminous Coal Commission or something, some government job.
Yeah.
And he'd been a district judge for several years.
You said that you read some of the old letters. Do you still have the letters?
Yeah.
Are they from your uncle in Washington? Or?
Oh, I've got some of those. They're more just personal things, late years. And I've got one, well, it's not the original. It's a Xerox copy, and it's barely readable. My nephew there in Oklahoma City has the original of a letter that my grandmother, my great-grandmother, wrote her son, which is my father's father. And it's surprising. She was apparently a full-blood Creek. My grandfather died as a young man. My father was just 8. And I think he was 37 to 81, 44 years old. But this letter is almost to think that I don't know anything about her as far as education, but the letter that she wrote, he was going to school up at Fayetteville, some school there before the university, of course. And apparently she was religious. She was cautioning him about reading his Bible and not getting in with a bad group of boys and staying out late and all of that kind of. But it was surprising that the type of letter that she could write. And I can show you but it's rather difficult. I think the university, not the university, the Historical Society, I'm pretty sure has a copy of it, because my mother sent the letter up there, but she wouldn't let them have things like they demand now, and the letter was sent back to her, and my nephew has it. But this grandfather, he was Creek instead of Choctaw, but he had a business there at Skullyville, and he had I guess he would have been called a peddler. He would go around through the territory and apparently take orders, and maybe would carry a stock of merchandise, and then come back and either fill the orders and go back around. And he kept I call it a day book. It's a combination, day book and diary. And during the early war period, well, it starts in 1861, and he mentions family affairs, and then a dozen pair of socks or something like that. Just, you could tell that he'd served as interpreter for the federal court over at Van Buren, so apparently he spoke at least Cherokee and Choctaw and Creek. But
what was his name?
Lyman Moore. And we know very, very little about him. This is pure guesswork on my part, because he was 3/4 Creek, and his mother, went by the name of this letter. She signs it Peggy Canad, K apostrophe N-A-D. But this book, he had a brother that was staying with him and apparently going to school there, a younger brother. And then he mentions another brother to this one, but they were going by the name of Canard, C-A-N-N-A-R-D. And they were from around, over in the Creek Nation, around Wetumpka and in there. Because I know we used to go through Wetumpka quite a bit. I noticed one day there, Canard Street. And I had asked Muriel Wright one time about them, and I said, they're just thick over there in that area, Wetumpka, Walika, Okima, and so on. And one of these was a chief of the Creeks, Rolly Canard or something. But this book he mentions, but he doesn't call him his brother or anything. But I just figured that is this Peggy Canard, but she spelled hers, and I think it was the Indian spelling. Mm-hmm. And my guess is that Moore was not my grandfather's name. I think it was rather common practice when the missionaries were down here. They couldn't pronounce the name, so they gave them a name that they could.
Do you know what your grandfather's name was?
I don't know. I would say, since she signed Canard, but I don't know enough about the Creek culture, whether they carried over with the husband and the wife. Now, some of the Texas tribes, I lived in Texas for a number of years, and some of those, they didn't change their name. The husband and wife didn't have the same name. So I don't know about the Creek.
Yeah.
I don't. But I'm satisfied that they anglicized the name enough to make it Canard. Mm-hmm. And I think there's still a bunch of them living over there. I've intended sometime just to go by and try to find some of them and see.
You still have this day book?
Yeah, I'll get it and let you. You can tell some of it is pretty easy to read.
Yeah.
I think it starts off 1861.
January 13th, 1861. Lyman Moore, Choctaw Agency.
Mm-hmm. That's what Skullyville at that time, I don't know exactly when they changed the name. It went by Skullyville for a long time. It was Skullyville County, and then Skullyville was the county seat. And I think when they put a post office in, I'm not sure whether they ever operated a post office as Skullyville.
Is Lyman Moore Dolly Vanderwall's father?
The son, Lyman Moore, the Dolly's father, is my father's brother.
Okay.
Actually, this would be Lyman Moore Sr., but there was really no need to make a senior and a junior because he just had Lyman Moore, and Dolly's father had a middle name. So, but yeah, Lyman Moore, the one you would be thinking, and my father were brothers, and he had a brother, Herbert.
Good morning.
Marcella, this is Mr. Todd, and I didn't catch your name.
James Brown.
Ooh.
James Brown.
Mr. Brown, glad to know you.
I don't know where to tell you. Let me get over here so we can find this Canard, because you might turn on a little more light up here somewhere. He just kept books that looked like, here it is, right there. There's one of them. Modi, and you can see how he spelled it.
Yeah. Cannard.
Now Modi, I'm pretty sure Modi was a Creek chief over there. And the boy that was staying there, they call him Nobly. And there was a noble, and I'm sure that's one, a noble.
Here's a Moore.
That's no,
No relation.
no. But he has a family, and I'm not too sure of his, he's been married before, but there's something in there that indicates, well, it's not indicates, it's plain in there that he lost a daughter. And it's a rather sad entry he has in there about him. But he apparently was married 3 times. And back in the back, you can see he had cattle over here around, I think, Kenta, in that area. And when he got over there to find, I found a lot of them. He's got an entry in there stolen by either the Choctaws or the Confederates or the Union. He didn't know who.
That's fascinating. When you said your uncle and your mother would talk about the old times, can you remember any specific stories that they'd talk about?
One that I always remember that just became a family joke, that when her brother would come back, they would always get to talking about people, and I think these were colored people that had been in the family. And one of them killed his wife, and with an axe. And Joe Bird killing Alice, and they'd always get back to that story, just talking about it. That's what always stuck with me, because it was, we just knew when they'd get together, they wouldn't see each other, maybe go for a year, he wouldn't be down here, but invariably, why, it would come to that. My mother's mother married Green McCurtain first, and then they had this child, and they separated. I never did know until way late. I asked my mother why, and my mother was a white woman, and they said it was a political, the Indians didn't like it that their chief was married to a white woman. And they were separated on good terms, and even my grandfather, when he married, he and McCurtain were on good terms. It was just one of those things.
What was her name, his first wife?
My grandmother,
Yeah.
her name was Martha, same as my mother. And her name, actually, it gets confusing. A bunch of them married. My grandfather and my grandmother were first cousins. But he was born out here, my grandfather, and this cousin was born in Mississippi and didn't come out here until after the war. So he didn't know her. I guess he knew of her or something, but 2 brothers, John Garrett Ainsworth and David Spence Ainsworth, 2 brothers, they were white. They were involved in moving the Indians out here, and one of them stayed here, and the other one has family in Mississippi, and he didn't move his family out here until 1869, I think, after the war. So, in a sense, a bunch of them were strangers. They didn't know, but The two brothers, the fathers of the bunch, and several of them married cousins. Another, my grandmother's sister married my grandfather's brother. So there's quite a number of that going on, and the community was so small that it turned out that as kids we were kin to about everybody over there, one way or another.
Now you say the two brothers helped move the Indians to.
Yeah, John Garrett Ainsworth and David Spence.
Was that during the removal?
I don't know when you date the removal. I don't know when I dated, but the ones in my family that were moved out here were moved out in the early 40s, around 1840.
Would that be early enough for the trail?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. So they weren't involved in the Trail of Tears then?
In what?
They were not
No.
involved in the Trail of Tears?
No, as far as, now my impression of the Trail of Tears, and I don't know on the Choctaws, my grandmother, my father's mother, was born in Alabama, and she came by boat up here, and they put them off down here. They called it Swallow Point, but later it was same as Fort Coffee. They later built a fort there, but I think at the time, they called it Swallow Point. It's about 2 or 3 miles north of here. And she, let's see, 40, she was just a child. But the whole family moved, and they had a cholera epidemic at that time, even on the boat. And one of her sisters died on the boat. But I never did consider that the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears, I think, was more in the Cherokees and more walking, if I know any of the
Yeah,
history.
now some of the Choctaws were moved in the 1830s.
Well, now there's some, they had 2 routes, as I understand it. A bunch of my folks that I have any knowledge of came by boat.
Yeah.
But some that went down, settled down in the south end, or the southeastern corner of the state, they had a different trail, and so they might have came overland.
Now, a lot of them did come by boat. We have letters
Yeah.
that state this.
Well, somewhere in my mother's notes I'd find, and of course she got the information just from talking and asking, that they left at a place called Moscow Landing. And I can find a Moscow in Mississippi, and then they were on the Tombigbee River, and they went down to Mobile and then came back up the Mississippi and the Arkansas. But we were over in that section and tried to find this and couldn't. It was right on or close to the Alabama line, and we could find some of the places mentioned, but as far as finding a Moscow Landing, even in, I don't know whether, I'm sure somebody has mentioned it someplace in history, because but said they boarded a boat at Moscow Landing.
Have you heard any stories or read stories in your mother's notes about coming by boat to Indian Territory?
Oh, it must have been rough. My mother's folks, they were all born here. My grandfather, he was born here. His father just stayed here, and his brother went back. So they had, I just figure, had been moving. My grandfather, my mother's father, was born in 1851. And I've just guessed that they were moving them out here in the 1840s. I don't have any dates for that. But now the cemetery over there has some burials in it is in the 1830s.
And the first Choctaws left 1830 or 31?
The organized route was 31.
Yeah, the first, I guess, Trail of Tears was 1831.
Yeah. Well, it could have been because they could have been, well, I know they were Choctaws because the cemetery there's got some that were buried, I believe, either 1833 or 37. I know it was in 1830 that on this.
That's in the Skullyville Cemetery?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they were here, but it's the exact time that my great-grandfather came out here and stayed, I just don't, that's
Yeah.
pure.
Do you still have all the notes and letters of your mother that you said you got the information from?
She would just scribble down on something, and she worked up a family tree and put it on that. But she didn't have, she wasn't corresponding with any, and didn't have any letters. There's one or two, I think, that somebody had brought in the early days. I remember one I've seen that the letters were carried by somebody going back to Mississippi. He'd just maybe bring it if he wasn't going all the way, if he was going to Fort Smith or say, and then catch somebody that way. And then some of them are just copies of letters. We never kept, I'm sure some of the relatives stayed back there, but we never kept up, never tried to find them if they did. And I didn't know until recently that I thought there were just the two brothers, but there were four of them. And one of them stayed in Arkansas, and no one ever heard from him again.
I was going to ask you if you do have these letters, would like to microfilm them if you'd let us, with the day book.
The ones, I don't have any letters that are there. Got some copies that are other people and later, but as far as letters that my mother had, no, I don't have it. That back in that early period.
Yeah. Would you let us make a copy of the day book?
Do what?
Would you let us copy the day book?
How you gonna copy it?
Well, we'll have to check with back in Oklahoma City first to see if they would approve it.
Do you think that would Xerox, or you mean just go through and copy it?
Oh, we're going to microfilm it. Put it on.
Well, some of it's a them. I don't think, or you know more about that than I do.
Oh, we could. We have a camera. It's actually just taking a picture of it, just a photograph.
I just hate for anybody for it to get out of my
Yeah,
hand.
right. Mm-hmm.
Because I've had experience little in times that, well, I let so-and-so have that and so, and by the time trace it, I'll never find so-and-so again.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. If it's okay, I'll have well, could my boss contact you? She's a senior archivist, and we're trying to get copies of everything for the Historical Society and the Choctaw Heritage Society. And we'll let you consider, whatever you decide to do.
I don't know anything about this procedure, but sometime when I'm going to Oklahoma City, I wouldn't mind bringing it by there.
Okay.
And
And that can be
if it's
arranged, yeah.
a thing that they could do in a matter of a few hours or something,
Mhm.
and I wouldn't mind.
Yeah, no, that can be arranged. I can,
I've got something else here I just ran across yesterday after you called. Well, I knew I had it, but I'd been in the process of trying to sort something out. And my father held offices in the Indian. He was a judge, county judge, and either a deputy sheriff, a sheriff, and my uncle was a clerk. And this is a piece, I guess it's a will. I'll get it and let you read it. It's back.
apparently he had, he said he was more or less like a traveling salesman. He'd travel around the country and
I think you can make about as much without me telling you there.
fine. Clerk's office, 1902. Lewis LaFleur, County Clerk, Skullyville.
Have you lived at Stigler or at
Keeling
Keeling?
all my life, with the exception of 2
Well,
years.
you probably have heard of Louis LaFleur.
I don't think so.
He was well, I don't know how to put it. He lived at Stigler, and he lived, well, I don't know just where. He was Camel LaFleur's son, and he was on the Board of Affairs in Oklahoma City back, I think, during Jack Walton's days. And there's a bunch of the LaFleurs around here. In fact, that's where we get the county name, LaFleur.
That's interesting. Yeah, Edgar A. Moore, judge.
Now that, I don't know whether you're familiar with early history over here or not, but there's something in this page, and who is it? Folsom. The Historical Society put a marker over here at Pecola. I think they're both buried there. I've never found the cemetery that they're buried, but the marker's a good ways away from the cemetery. And Page has a grandson that's living in Poto, and some of the facts that he told, used to be a county superintendent here that wrote a history of LaFleur County in the last 20 years. And some of the facts that he gave don't jibe with this, and I think this is pretty accurate here because it was filed at that time. And even the historical marker has some wrong dates on it, according to this. I think they have that he died in 97, or maybe it was Folsom, one of them. I know it raised a question to me. Folsom was a preacher, among other things.
Adriel Folsom.
Willis, wasn't it?
Okay, yeah.
Page.
I saw the name Page in there.
Well, this is mainly about Page, but I thought it mentioned Folsom. But what roused my curiosity, I'm pretty sure on this marker, they have that Folsom died before 97. And Folsom married my father and my mother. He was a minister of some sort. And they married in 97. So I knew that was wrong. And I haven't on the date over there, so it's easy enough. Somebody says, when you ask them 30 or 40 years later, And it might even, I've noticed, on some, even they'll have wrong dates on tombstones. That just don't. I was thinking in here that it mentioned Folsom, but maybe not. But the marker over there is for Page and Folsom.
Where did you start the school?
Where did I start?
Yes, sir.
There at Oak Lodge. Would be, that was the name of the school,
What about 1913?
13.
Was it Oak
Two-
Lodge School or what?
Yeah, school district number 35. I always remember that. It was a two-room school. Later they added, and I don't think they ever got beyond just a common school, a grade school, but they added just double the size of the building, and then they demolished it a few years back. But when I started, there were two rooms, and I think up to the fourth, maybe the fifth grade in one room, and just had up to eighth grade. And the sixth, seventh, and eighth in the other room. And the school, the building, had the partition was a folding type of thing. They could open it up and make it just one big room. But most of the time they kept it. But I went there until we moved. Folks moved out the 1st of January in 1917. Moved to Spiro. So I went to school there from 13.
How come your folks moved to Spiro?
Why?
Yes, sir.
Skullyville began to go downhill when the railroad came through here. And instead of coming through Skullyville, they missed it about a mile. And Spiro was settled about 98. And people began to move out because it was, growing and had a little better facilities and all. But my folks stayed until over there until 1916. We moved the last day of the year.
How come the railroad missed Skullyville?
I don't know whether it was the terrain or whether promoters or not. I don't know just the reason, because they had to make a big, if you're familiar, Salisaw's back over here, and they crossed the river due north of us and make a big curve around this. We're on sort of a hill here, and they make a big curve around. Actually, the railroad is south of us and north of us and east of us. But as to why, unless in making a survey, that was better. Of course, it could have been over at Skullyville. It just might been that they were crossing the river over there. They'd had to make a sharp bend back. I just don't know. Might have been land promoters that in here, because they sold lots here, and I think maybe a good ways back in the east they sold. And the town was much bigger, or not bigger necessarily, but long in the 20s, before the Real Depression hit, they had at one time 5 gins here, 5 cotton gins, 3 banks, 2 nice, they didn't call them department stores, mercantile, 2 nice stores, and the thing that really, I think, it killed the town, and of course there were no highways. They built a highway through here in 1923, Before that, you just go by section line and zigzag. Anybody that made the attempt to go to Fort Smith in the very early days, it would take them probably an hour and a half if they could make it at all. There were no roads, and but they built the highway from Fort Smith, from the Arkansas line to Worcester. Might have built it on to Red Oak, but that was the first, and that was the beginning of the downfall of Spiro. People could drive over there in 30 minutes, and but before, why, we had, well, I think at one time 5 doctors here. Don't have an MD now at all. Haven't had for years. Used to have a dentist and just everything they needed. But as far as why the railroad came, because they put a spur in from here to Fort Smith. They used to run 12 to 14 passenger trains through here a day. They had one line that went from Fort Smith. They called it, well, the people thought of it as Oklahoma City, but it, I think the western end of it might have been Guthrie, someplace north of Oklahoma City, and then they would switch in somebody else's line. You'd go to Oklahoma City on it, the Fort Smith and Western. Never was successful. The thing, finally, it went out of commission in the, I guess, the early 30s. I don't think it ever made money. It was just a poorly, wasn't enough demand for it, because the Rock Island went just south, went through Howell and Worcester and on to Oklahoma City, and there just wasn't enough business for this thing. Didn't even go through McAllister, went through Crowder. Just a bunch of little wide places in the road. He'll know some of them: Lee Choir, Kenta, Bocosha, Quinton, and there just wasn't enough demand for a railroad that way. But they would run trains out here from Fort Smith to connect to the main line, Pullmans, all.
Who were, when you first moved to Spiro, who were some of the most prominent people that lived here?
I've got a thing, and you can discount. Let me show you how they promoted the deal. I don't really know who put that out. I say it's some promoter. I don't think it was.
November 1903, Spiro.
But you can read through that and tell that he was plugging individuals in the businesses, and it really doesn't, I know enough to know that it is not an accurate picture of the town. But getting back to your question, Red Wine Brothers came in here in 1898 and put in a store. And about the same time, they came over from Arkansas, Greenwood and that area. And about the same time, Dumplin came up from Texas, northeast Texas, and they put in a store here, and they were related by marriage, intermarried. But there had been stores here at Spiro in the early days. there was a prominent Jew came in, put a store in here, and later moved it to Fort Smith.
What was his name?
Isaacson. And some of the, I guess some of them are still over there, some of the, but Fort Smith in the early days had a lot of Jews. Came down from St. Louis and all, and they went on as far as, I think, Stigler, Tamaha, up there.
Do you remember World War One?
Yeah, very well.
Tell me about it.
Well, I was interested in, I always liked to read, and I was reading, and of course, newspaper was the only means of getting it. And when we moved out here, they hadn't declared war, but the war had been going on. And I remember the talk of the young men that were enlisting and leaving right quick. And then the draft came along, and at the first draft, I think was 21 to 31. And as the war got hotter, they increased that age group, made it 18 to 45, and it caught, the first group didn't catch any of our family. My oldest brother was too young, and my father was above the age. But the 18 to 45 caught both of them. And November the 11th, they were supposed to go to Poto for induction. I don't know whether it was, I think first they processed them, and then if they were going to take them, then come back at a later date. But November the 11th, the kids came out on the early morning train, had a train in here about 5 o'clock in the morning. And newsboys came out with extra papers, running up and down all over town, hollering extra and extra, and they got word back. So my father and brother didn't go to Poto. They put that off. So those are two of the things that stuck with me. And of course, the Armistice Day, that whole country, but here they started celebrating as soon as they got the word, and they didn't have much in those days to make a noise, so they made it. I don't know whether you've ever heard of shooting anvils.
I've heard about it. Tell me about it.
Well, they, right in the where Main Street and the highway crosses now, there was a blacksmith shop over there in front of the Methodist church, and of course it wasn't a highway, just a street there then. And they got an anvil from the blacksmith, and I guess it was a pump rod that you would have for water pump. Long rod, about 20 feet long, half-inch in diameter or such. And they would fill the hole in an anvil, you know, where they put different tools, and fill that hole with powder and leave a little sticking out, and then set another anvil on it, and they had a fire going to keep this rod red hot. And they'd touch that rod to the powder, and it would burn in and explode. Made a pretty good sized noise, and they shot that thing all day long, just kept busy. As soon as it'd blow the anvil off, they'd fill it up with powder and set it off again, and that was the main way of celebrating.
How high would it shoot the anvil?
Oh, I think, of course, those anvils, they were big and heavy. Maybe that high, just fall off is the noise they were creating. And I expect, that is the thing that impressed me. I was 11. No, yeah, 1918 I was 11. I expect that there was a lot of pistol shooting. Used to do that. Because the only time we ever got firecrackers were Christmas time and sometimes 4th of July. But we always shot firecrackers at Christmas. Sort of a crude way to celebrate Christmas, but with a bang.
How did the Depression affect Spiro?
How does the what?
The Great Depression, the 20s, the 30s. How did that affect the town and your family?
Well, I was away from here. I think I'm hard of hearing, and I think I need to change battery. So if I left here really in the late 20s and worked a while, and then in the 30s, early 30s, well, I was away from here, but I started working for the U.S. Weather Bureau. And I started up at Broken Arrow and was there for a few months, and they sent me to Del Rio, Texas, right down on the Mexican border, and stayed there about a year. So a bunch of that period, we'd come back most of the time at least once a year. But so it's a big blank in there as far as affecting us. The merchants pulled in and the banks went broke, and they had 3 banks here when they closed the banks in 33, and one of them was in good shape. So when they allowed them to open, why, it opened right up, and the others, and I'm not sure of just the time on it, but then 2 of the other 2 merged. I don't know whether it was immediately after the president allowed them to open, or whether it was some time, but they wound up with 2, and then finally the surviving, they just closed it out and left one bank. And I don't know as far as the figures how many people left here, but a raft of them took part in the Grapes of Wrath movement to California. And this county, I think, lost something like a 4th population. It was at one time about 13th or 14th population-wise, and it seemed like the population was something like 40-some thousand, and it dropped down to the low 30s. And it gradually built back. I have to check now to see just what it is, but it was severe here. At that time, it was just strictly cotton and corn country. They raised cotton, and well, they had 5 gins, cotton, and they raised a lot of potatoes here, Irish potatoes. But now there's not to my knowledge, there's not a cotton gin in the county or anywhere close. No cotton raised here in this bottom at all, and very little corn. So the agriculture just changed completely.
What were your duties with the Weather Bureau?
I started out, of course, the terms they used are changed while I was in there, but they started out as observers and then meteorologists. And when it broke an era, they had a kite station. They sent big kites up. They had no means of knowing what was above us, and they had big box kites that they would send. And if I recall, I wasn't there too long, they had instruments, and they would release kites back in and bring the instrument down, and that gave them pressure, temperature, and humidity aloft, and maybe up no higher than 3,000 or 4,000 feet. But they had no means of getting, and later they abandoned that and they used airplanes. They could go much higher, quicker, and carry these instruments. So they closed that station at Broken Arrow. I left there in beginning of '31, and I don't know the exact date, but they closed it within a few years.
Yeah.
And I spent most of my time in Texas. I did move to Albuquerque for a couple of years, but most of the time in Texas. And we were largely providing aviation service. I was from Del Rio. It wasn't on an airline or anything, but when I got up to Big Spring out in West Texas, the airlines were just starting. And then from then on, it was always primarily for aviation.
And was it your job to get the kite up, to fly the kite?
Oh, they had a crew.
Had a crew.
They'd take, one man would get out and they had him, I guess it would be a Rube Goldberg contraption nowadays. They had a big reel of piano wire or such, and get this kite out, and you could fly it without much wind. If it was too much wind, you couldn't, or weather. But they could reel this thing in and get it up to where it strikes some wind, and that's been so long, and my figures might be entirely wrong, but they would let out maybe a mile or mile and a half of line for this kite. Sometimes they'd have more than one to lift it. And then also they use balloons.
What about World War II?
About what?
World War II.
Yes, I remember that too. We were in Abilene before, you in the bathroom?
Yes.
If you are. They were getting ready a year to a year and a half before, and they built a camp there. In those days, looking back, not so far, but it was pretty crude. A lot of them, they built huts for them, a wooden floor, a lot of it, and wood up part of the way in a tent. And then they built some barracks, but that made Abilene boom. Just carpenters, workmen, any kind coming in, building the camp. As soon as they got it up where it would even house soldiers, why they were drafting them like mad, and they were building camps all over. Texas had, must have had 6 or 8. Had a number of permanent posts, but we were not deferred on account of our occupation. They drafted some of the fellows out of this weather service, but I was never, at that time we had 2 children, And I forget, I think my classification seemed like 3A or something like that. But I never served, and it wasn't even called. The main thing I remember as far as it affecting us, I had lots of relatives in the service, but none that were real close. But the rationing and doing without affected all of us.
Have you heard any Civil War stories?
Oh, I don't know. I think more that is what I read rather than heard. I asked my grandmother one time about it because I was interested in the Civil War. I like to read it, and I asked her, and I don't know where she was, and I think she must have been, if she was here, must have been mistaken, but she said all she remembered of it was they could hear the cannons from Pea Ridge. Well, you couldn't hear the cannon from Pea Ridge if she was at Skullyville. They did have a battle, Honey Springs, somewhere around, and some, but a lot of them, I think, left Skullyville during the war there. You find very few stones with them that date on them. And the girls' school, New Hope Seminary, they closed it during the war. But I just figured that a lot of the people left, and because they had no protection, the Union soldiers were coming in from the north, and they organized a Choctaw brigade or battalion or something. Tandy Walker was, he's buried over here, one of the early chiefs. In fact, the house that my grandfather lived in was the agency, and he either bought it from Tandy Walker or got it soon after Tandy Walker. I think he moved over either to Weber's Falls, Tamaha, someplace over there, but they brought him back to bury him over here at Skullyville. But he was a colonel in the Confederacy and made up of, if it was a brigade, it was a Choctaw brigade. But no, I didn't. As far as talking to, I just don't, none of my folks, now the one that stayed in Mississippi, the great, he was, well, my great-grandfather's brother. He was in the war over there, all through it. But he died before my day, so just most of them, if they had any direct memory, they didn't want to talk about it.
The house that you say your grandfather lived in was the agency?
Yeah.
Did he buy it from the agent?
I don't know how, whether it was sold when it quit being used as an agency, but Colonel Walker lived in it, and about that time, my mother wasn't born in that house, but shortly after it, my grandfather got it some way, And my mother spent most of her early days in that house.
Is it still standing?
No, it burned in, I think, 1947, I believe. When they settled my grandfather's estate, my uncle, my mother's brother, got the old home place, and he lived in it. Well, my grandfather, my grandmother died before I was born, and my grandfather later married again, 5 or 6 years later, married again, and he died in 1917, but his widow stayed in the house until around 1940 or early 40s, and she died, and then my uncle got the house, and he lived in it. I'm not sure now whether he was living there when it burned or not, but it burned, and there's no sign. There's a spring there that has rather widespread interest for people. There's several springs over there, but that one was called Ainsworth Spring, and people still go there to get water and carry water. And there was a spring up about a mile east of there. I think they called it Pebble Spring. It was where they built the Indian Girls School. And during the early 20s, Fort Smith's water was so bad, and Spiro's water wasn't much better, but the fella started bottling that water and carrying it to Fort Smith. And he made, I won't say he got rich, but he had a good business going for several years there, selling Hood Springs. It changed the name of it. The fellow's name was Hood, and but he rigged up a truck and these 5-gallon bottles, and he just did a land office business selling water.
Who was the last Choctaw agent to live in that house?
Well, I think Tandy Walker was an agent.
Was he the agent?
I think he was.
Okay.
McClellan built the house. I think he was a major or something that they'd sent down. And the house was built in, I believe, around 1830. And I know that some notes that somebody had written that when my father's mother came out here and family, they landed down at what is presently Fort Coffee, but it's called Swallo Point. And they had this infant that had died on the way up. They buried her right there. And then they came by the agency to get provisions and to tell them where to go to live. Of course, that was way before the allotment days. And this family, they sent them over on Poto River. I visualize, are you familiar with Fort Smith at all?
Yes, sir.
If you know where South Fort Smith, there's a community, it's part of the town now, but was called Kavanaugh. You don't know the difference now. But then just south of Kavanaugh, there's a cemetery, Laird Cemetery. It dates back to at least to the early 50s. because my great-grandfather and grandmother are buried there. It's right on the state line. Part of it is in Arkansas and part in Oklahoma. And the stones that they identified as CN, in other words, for Choctaw Nation instead of IT like Indian Territory. But I didn't know anything about this cemetery until we came back here in the 60s. And I'd go over there. They were buried on the Arkansas side. And I don't suppose that when they put the cemetery in, they knew exactly where the line was. It was just open. But a lot of the early day, but when my grandmother, she was just a young girl, but they went by the agency and they sent them over to Poto River, Poto Bottom. They were, all of them came. This great grandfather was a lawyer, a surveyor, and I don't know what else, from over in Mississippi and Alabama. But he was white. He married.
Did you know Tandy Walker?
No. Tandy Walker died, I would say back in, I'm just guessing now, in the 1880s.
Have you heard of Samuel Rutherford?
The name, I can't tie it into anything but the name.
He was the first agent, wasn't he? He was the first Choctaw agent.
He was the first agent?
Yeah. In 1830s?
Probably, or late 20s.
Yeah.
He came before removal, didn't he?
Yeah. He was at Three Forks in 1817. So where Muskogee is now.
Well, now this Three Forks, that's not the same as North Forks.
I don't think so.
That is where my great-grandmother, she lived. They called it Micco, M-I-C-C-O, and it's also North Forks, I believe. It's just a couple of miles east of Eufaula. I think I've stopped by one cemetery over there just thinking maybe I could see some, but I think that where she was living is probably in the lake. But it was M-I-C-C-O, and it also had the name of, I think, either North Fork or Three Forks. Letter that she wrote her son, she was living there.
Yeah. Three Forks is where, I guess, the three rivers join, where Muskogee is now.
Three Forks?
Yeah.
See if did they call it, Three Forks. Traditional name applied to the region immediately north of Muskogee at the confluence of the Neosho, Verdigris, and Arkansas. Yeah, that's Three Forks.
That's where they had a trading post in 1817. Then he became the first Choctaw agent.
Well, let's see what this gives for the. He and his brother had a store, and he had been superintendent of the New Hope Seminary. He was rather prominent in local.
Now, what was his name?
Tom Ainsworth.
Tom Ainsworth.
And the post office, or the postal service said no, that it was too near down in either Johnson, extreme southern part. There was an Aylesworth, Aylesworth. They said there'd be too much confusion between Ainsworth and so they hit on Oak Lodge
Yeah.
for some reason.
Yeah, Armstrong was
Choctaw Nation.
He was a major.
he was in charge of, I guess, the whole removal from Mississippi.
Well, they built a cemetery.
He was an agent, wasn't
Fort
he? Oh,
Fort
Okay.
Coffee was up on a bluff. During this river work, they practically used the bluff, but on a good day, you can stand in the back here, you can see what's left of it. But that was the fort. The river made a bend around, and they had a cemetery there. Little, I guess, in that day, it was a little military cemetery. And I can remember as a kid going down there, and there was an Armstrong buried there. When they were doing the work here, they removed the remains, if any. Guess they took them to National Cemetery, Fort Smith or someplace. But there was a little, and I can remember, marker Armstrong. Now, whether it was the Major Armstrong, I was under the impression it was, but now I don't know whether he died or some of his family.
was he the agent or was he a military man?
The Major Armstrong that was in the article
Yeah.
that your job sent became an agent.
Oh, okay. You say that this Tom Ainsworth was the superintendent of New Hope Seminary.
Mhm.
Do you know anything about him?
Do what?
Do you know anything about him?
Oh, yes. He was my grandfather. I remember him well.
What was he like?
Well, I guess it would depend. No, I think everybody spoke well of him. But he died, I was 10 years old when he died. And we lived, the equivalent of about 2 blocks where my folks lived, about the equivalent of 2 blocks from the agency. And of course, he was by the house, or we were over there as kids. And he had education. He was a smart man. He went to school, I don't think very much, but they had a school, Cane Hill, up north of Fort Smith, up there, maybe halfway up to Fayetteville or something. He went to school there, and I don't know beyond that. I guess his education was gotten right there in Skullyville, but he was involved in the statehood thing. He went to Washington several times on hearings or something that they were having. And those that knew him thought highly of him. But looking back, I thought he was an old man. But he was only 66 when he died. But back then, little kids, anybody that was 30 or 40 was old, and now he would have been far from being considered old. But
When was he superintendent of New Hope?
92, I would say, 92 to 96 or some such there. Now those are not to be held to be accurate, because I really think He wasn't superintendent at that time.
Would you folks consider eating lunch with us? Would you folks consider eating lunch with us?
Would you like it?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Would you?
Thank you.
Now, this one that gives 1886 to 1892, and Dr. Griffith was superintendent. So I would say that maybe my grandfather in 93 to maybe 96, something like that.
When was New Hope constructed?
I believe back in 1840 something.
Is this the original building?
Yeah,
What's left over there at New Hope?
not a thing. That building, it burned shortly after my grandfather was, I would say that he was fired from the job. They played politics a lot. And I would say he was dismissed or fired or whatever.
It says burned December 31st, 1896.
That was just what I was thinking about.
Uh,
Burned.
Here's something to show you what type of,
Elocution contest.
and some of those were from, my mother was in it,
Mrs. Ainsworth?
yeah,
Miss Ainsworth.
that's my mother. And quite a few of those are names that were prominent. McAllister and Haley. From Haleyville over here.
Here's it right.
And I don't know whether this Mrs. Moore, I don't think that, well, that could have been an aunt of mine, I'm not sure. There's a Metcalf, you reckon he's related, or rather she would be, it doesn't spell it exactly. But he's from over here, Cowlington, isn't he?
Metcalf?
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
yeah. He had some
Yeah.
connection with Cowlington.
That's probably true because his sister lives in Kyoto.
I wanted to, the last time I was up there, I had a complaint, and the other fellow wasn't in. What was his name before? Jack somebody.
Jack Wettengill.
Yeah. I had written him about this cemetery over here, and he never answered. Oh, about 6 months later, he answered it, but the letter was signed by him, but it was written by, and also signed by Metcalf, but he wasn't director at that time. But
Did you write about the monuments that are tumbled over?
no, it's not tumbled over.
No, in the cemetery, or Skullyville?
Yeah,
I was there about 3 weeks ago, and there's 4 large monuments that have been pushed over or turned over.
well, what I was concerned about, we, and I use the word we because the thing was formed as a corporation way back. And it was just neglected and all, and when I came back, I began sort of cleaning up around there, and other people got interested in it, and we found that by it being a corporation, that they had to have some meetings ever so often, and to act as a, so we got a lawyer down here that was more or less interested in it, and we had several meetings, and I think his name was Guess or Guest, and if I'm not mistaken, he was
Is that?
in the insurance business in Oklahoma City, but he had family ties over in Cherokee Nation. And he got interested in this cemetery and approached, well, he was apparently a close friend of Shirk. Was Shirk that wrote this? Yeah. George Shirk used to be mayor of Oklahoma City, and he was involved in the Historical Society. So they took the cemetery over and left with, made it, in a sense, a closed cemetery, except those who had family ties could still use it. And we deeded it to them, and they were to maintain it. And for a year or two, they had a field man that would come by, and it seemed like 3 or 4 times a year. He would go by Tom down in McCurtain County or someplace, and Sequoia's home place over here. And but then, since then, I don't know what happened to him, but to my knowledge, no one from the Historical Society has ever set foot on the place again. They pay a man to mow it, and he was mowing it with a brush hog and just knocking stones and kicking them around and covering them. And several of the people who had relatives buried there were complaining. Well, they knew that I had been doing work over there, so they'd always get a complaint to me. And I wrote Wettenkill and asked them to check on it and see if they couldn't get somebody to mow it with a riding mower. Well, he just ignored my letter for about 6 months and said, well, they agreed that it wasn't, using a brush hog wasn't the best way to mow it, but if I knew of anybody, why, to get them. Well, I thought, hell, I'm not going to go through that again if they don't have enough interest to even answer my letter until 6 months. And but they're still mowing it with a brush hog and knocking over stones, covering them up, chipping them.
This is Skullyville Cemetery?
Yeah.
I have pictures of all the monuments that are over, and I sent to the Historical Society, but they didn't
And
respond to it.
I asked, I went in there to see Wettengill, but he wasn't in, and I talked to, I can't call his name, had office pretty close. He was sharing office with somebody else. He didn't have anything to do with this, but he said, I will relay your message and problem. And what I wanted, as much as anything, but for the field man, if they still have one, to show a little interest in it. They did when we first deeded it to him. He'd come by quite often, had a regular schedule. And as far as I know, no one has ever set foot. A lease man came here, well, that's several years ago, got the dope from me, wanted to lease it for oil and gas. There was no oil, gas. And I think they got $600 for the bonus lease. And I either suggested to someone up there, Muriel Wright might have been still living, someone, that they use that there's 2 or 3 stones there that are of historical value that just fell down. There's one, the oldest grave that I found in there was the Hall family. I don't know, no one knew them still living that knew anything about them, but I got that they were prominent and apparently in those days wealthy, because the thing had a big, I later found out that some people call a mausoleum out of stones, big one-piece stone, about 7 or 8 feet, about 3 or 4 feet high, and then a great big one on top. And there were 5 people buried in this one grave from 1837 to maybe 1840 something. And then they had a what I'd always call a footstone, that looked a little bit like a miniature Washington monument, about so high and come up to a point. Well, those things, when I was a kid, they were all up in good shape, but someplace during the time, why, they just collapsed. I don't know that anybody, but it would take a piece of machinery to re-erect them. And I suggested to somewhere, I don't know whether it ever got there, that they take that $600 and put that was the most elaborate stone except for Edmund McCurtain buried there. They've got an elaborate stone, but this one dates the very beginning of the cemetery. And so I just gave up, and they didn't show any more interest in.
Where was New Hope located?
It's on the old highway. It's about a mile east of Skullyville. And of course, there's not too much at Skullyville now. There's a cluster of houses there, but New Hope is about a mile east of Skullyville.
Was there a cemetery at New Hope?
Oh yeah, big cemetery.
It's still there?
Yeah, very active. Very active. For one thing, they can bury them there for nothing or $5, and it's maybe about that time. It's
What,
not
1830s, 1840s?
well, it's not 1830. This other one is 1830. I would say 1840, maybe when they established the school, and somewhere 1844 sort of sticks in my mind that when New Hope was established, it was the Indians, I think the Methodist Church, the Indians might have built it, and seems like that the Methodist operated it for a while. And then later the Choctaw government took over the operation. And it might have been built, the New Hope Cemetery, as a result of the school being right adjacent.
What's this photograph?
That was one of the businesses. That is my grandfather's store there in Skullyville.
What kind of store was it?
Oh, but back in those days, I guess you'd just call it mercantile. They handled some dry goods and groceries, and some of them handled hardware, and even one, I had two grandfathers that had stores there, and one of them had lumber and just everything that you'd. That, I think that picture is 93.
Yeah. Okay. James, do you have any?
Do you remember when Will Durant was chief of the Choctaws? When he was chief, there was some segregated coal land that was sold. Do you know if he had the power to sell this or if the Choctaws voted on it?
I would say that I'd say yes and no. If I understand it right, the chief has the power right today to sell it. And the reason I say that, I have a cousin here they've got some unallotted land right down here in the bottom. And he was trying to buy it, and he was dealing with the Muskogee office, and Semple was the attorney at that time. Semple had been chief, and if everything was in line, but he didn't bid quite enough, it wasn't an auction sale. He just went up, I'll give you 1,500 or whatever. And I had heard that if he'd have made his offer a little bit more, he would have gotten it. So I would say yes, the chief has the power to sell, and I don't know whether now then that they've got this more or less, I don't know how active the council is, whether they have to approve or not.
Do you remember this incident with the coal and Chief Durant?
Yeah, all of this land, I won't say all of it, but they used to use the term segregated land, and the asphalt, coal and asphalt rights were reserved by the tribe. And
Well, the reason I'm asking, when they sold this land, it seemed that a lot of the Indian burial grounds were sold with the coal land. Why do you think that the Choctaws let the burial grounds go? Do you think it wasn't properly surveyed, or what could have happened?
I don't know whether I got you right. You say it was sold without it?
No, when the segregated land was sold, there were several Indian burial grounds on this land that was also sold
Yeah.
to the federal government. And I can't understand now why the Choctaws would have sold the cemeteries.
I don't know whether they had laws at that time, but I think they do now, that you can't disturb a cemetery. I know there's one that Governor Turner bought over here. He had a big feeding operation east of here, and they discovered a little, back in those days, in fact today, you can bury wherever you want to almost, but they discovered this little family cemetery there, 2 or 3 graves, and he put a fence around it to protect it. And but they have had cases where no one around, no one knew, they just knock them and go on. But I think since then that they have passed laws. It's like everything else. No one says anything about it. Why, it goes without. But there's lots of little grave family, I'd call them, family cemeteries scattered around that very few people know they're there.
Do you remember Alice McCurtain, Jane Austen McCurtain?
No, I just know who she was. Now, she is Dolly's grandmother, my cousin's grandmother.
Have you heard any stories about her? They said she had a lot of power for a woman.
Yes, because my father was on the council, and he stayed with her. She lived not too far from the council house, and he stayed with her. And I've heard that, I don't know through whether it was education, power, because her husband died in 1884, and but there's a dormitory there at the university, Jane Austen McCurtain dormitory, that somebody thought enough to name the dormitory, but no, I don't. I'm sure. I remember my aunt living here, who was Jane Austen's daughter, going back and forth to Tuscaloosa. So I don't know. She must have died up in the late 20s.
24, I believe.
34?
24.
24. But I just remember, and she had several daughters and a son or two, but I never knew any except the one that became my aunt and lives here.
Did you do any work for WPA?
Do what?
Did you do any work for the
No,
WPA?
no. And I wasn't here when all of that was going on. So they
When
did.
you know, when they dug the mounds over here, the spiral mounds?
Yeah.
Were you here then?
No, I came back and I went down there when I'm not sure whether that was after the state took it over or not. But I remember going down there, and we knew, and everybody knew, those mounds were here, and Thoburn was down here back in 1914 when they built the railroad through. They uncovered some burial grounds right down here, and Thoburn came, and they called one of them, it was my grandmother's allotment, and they called it the Moore site. And when they built this new bridge down here, they were excavating again in that area, and they found some remains, some bones. And they had to stop work because the law now, they stopped work until the archaeologist or somebody from the university came over here, and they sifted and all and let them go. But no, I wasn't here at that time. I just heard about it when those commercial operators, if I heard correctly, it was sort of secretive the way they operated. Did a lot of it at night, and they're just three men, and I think they were a little suspicious of one another, and I never heard of it. We knew that they were down the mounds. We didn't think, and we knew that the burial grounds, because Thoburn was here in 1914, and but why it waited that long for somebody to get in there and start digging? We were in New York and went out to I forget the museum, and there they had the biggest display was Spiro Mound. All you had to do was say Spiro, and they knew what. And other people down here, these commercial fellows sold a bunch of it to this, I suppose he's a rich man there in either New York or New Jersey. He bought a raft of this stuff and donated it to this museum in New York.
Are you familiar with any of the old, I guess one example would be the burial customs of the Choctaws?
buried just like white folks as far as I know. Now I have been to some that were just a little bit different. Like I had an aunt there in Stigler, died a number of years back, and they had more or less an Indian service. I know they had a quartet that sang in Choctaw. I don't remember whether the preacher, but she was Green McCurtain's daughter, and an old timer. But as far as no, I don't know. I think the customs that I grew up with was just like the.
Yeah.
We made so little distinction as when I had early days in school. All I remember is ever so often, once a year I guess, they'd say, all of you that are Choctaws, hold up your hand. They got so much money for us going to school. I don't know whether they still do that or not, but either the BIA or somebody, they'd get some money, but we just went. We knew who were Indians and who weren't, but we never thought anything.
You have any questions? Well, we have a good interview, I think. Anything else that you want to?
I beg your pardon?
Anything else you want to talk about?
No, I can think because I get every now and then. I got tied in. I really wasn't working on family tree as much. My mother had started, but I was just keeping it in my head mostly, and I never did have it straight. And I got a letter here several years ago from Medicine Lodge, Montana. Actually, they just addressed it to Skullyville Cemetery, and it wound up in my hand. So she was wanting to know about certain people. Well, I knew I'd seen the graves around, and I said, yeah, I know where they're buried. And got to writing her, and she was a young minister's wife up there. And the funny part of it, it turned out that we're very distantly related. But that got me more interested, and she was real active in it. I don't know, I had a piece here that I didn't know that how they did it, but it was where they made the annuity payments in 1855, and it was just that she had dug up, I think, in Washington, and they started from the agency and numbered. The houses, of course, weren't numbered or anything. And it turned out that all of them were kinfolks. And they'd go by and they listed all the people. I thought I had. This is my, if you're at all interested in it. You've seen these, haven't you?
Oh, yes, sir.
Patents. We always called them patents. I don't know whether that's in here. Certificates. where did those photos of the school, New Hope, are they in? Oh yeah, there they are.
So this fell out right here.
Oh, that's, I'm sure that appeared in the Chronicles. Here it is, by orders of Major Armstrong, who became the first Choctaw agent in the West. Is that what you
Okay.
question?
So
Yeah.
Rutherford wasn't the first agent.
It's interesting.
An agency bill 15 miles west of Fort Smith. That's not quite the best location.
Well, sir, thank you.
Oh, and some is,
Kathleen and I have been discussing this. This book here says it means fire gone out.
mhm.
And a lot of the old Choctaws says that's not correct.
I don't know. I've got a Choctaw dictionary, but I have difficulty reading it. It's not one that was put out by a lot, just like we knew that Scully meant money. I don't know whether, and of course there's the spelling,
I asked.
and I knew that Pocola meant 10 miles from Fort Smith, and my mother used to, just as a saying, took a load, took Chanic with Obby, 2, 3, 4. Now I don't know whether I could even find the spelling in here, and we knew a few words that we would use, some supposedly dirty and some not. I don't know how I'm going to find Kyoto. It's probably something besides a K, isn't it?
I'm not sure.
I asked Scrivener James what that means. I asked if keel meant no, and Barry didn't know what it meant.
K-E.
That's what I thought.
No.
but he-
I don't see a Kyoto in it.
Well, Kathleen had suggested, if this book says that 176 Choctaws died in Kyoto and that it was an entire clan. Of course, this made the clan extinct from the Choctaw tribe. And she was saying that if we could document this, we could probably get the Historical Society to erect a marker at Kyoto, but we can't find anything to document any of that.
Well, Kathleen, if she doesn't know or have access to it, I don't know who would,
She's quite a
because
historian.
I didn't know until I got this book that it
Okay, here is K-E-Y-U, no. Or Keo, K-E-Y-O-H, differs from Kiyu, K-E-Y-U, which is no, nay, not. Kiyu, a negative, a negation, nay, no.
Well, I discovered a long time ago the way that the words are said, and you got to know a lot to try to find. I didn't realize what I had in that dictionary. When my mother died, we just divide stuff up, and I think that the Five Tribe Museum, somebody donated a dictionary to them, and they've put a value of $35 on it. I don't know whether you can still get them, but I was in Washington back in the late 20s, had an old fellow that had taught school at Skullyville. He was the one the government would send down. My father went to school to it. And so I went by to see him, and of course it'd been years and years, but he was carried away, and I mentioned this dictionary. Oh, he'd like to have one. I just stopped by the government printing office, bought one for about $1.75 or $1.95 or something like that. They just had them in stock. And I don't know whether they've sold all of them, but they stopped, Roberts was publishing the rolls.
Right.
They stopped him from doing that. He published a dictionary, sort of an abbreviated of this. I don't know whether that was legal or what, but I never could see why it was illegal to
I never
print the
understood that.
rolls.
Do you understand that, Joe?
What?
Hollis in the travel paper, on each issue in the back, he was printing the dollars roll and the roll numbers, and the federal government stopped him.
Well, the laws came out, what, 1906, 1905, the final roll? Unless it'd be the Privacy Act of some sort, but...
Kathleen has a Dawes enrollment book that belonged to D.C. McCurtain.
Well, my cousin has both of the books. You've got to have two, or you spend a lot of time looking. And then there were some others that were issued, and I don't know whether they were issued by the government or by some private concern, that showed where your allotment was, that real estate people used. I don't know, as far as my folks, we never had one. And back in those days, I think they would have been easy to give.